Lux Occult is a part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.
I step into the mirror and I kiss myself, full on the mouth. When I open my eyes, we are kestrels with talons buried in each other's chests. How beautifully we rend each other rib from rib. Beak sharpens beak. We stop for whiskey and tattoo ourselves on the torsos of sleeping men. When they wake, they itch and scratch against instruction, but as kestrels, blood is our birthright. We are both John, and blood is our birthright. What weapon can I use against myself but my father's silence sown in my flesh? Burrs and beet seeds, I am a garden of wrath. How beautiful I am, roots roiling red from the earth, plumed men, beak to beak. The crash of broken glass I take to be the sound of rain. That is Birdsong by John Allen Taylor. Hello and welcome to Lux Occult. This is the podcast where we gleefully taunt the mundane, butcher the Latin and most other languages, and we also discuss a variety of occult, esoteric, and adjacent topics, exploring the intersections of magic, science, art, philosophy, technology, and so much more through the lens of chaos magic. This is occultism for everyone. I'm your host, Lux Strata, and if you're hearing the sound of my voice right now, that means that this show, and magic for that matter, are for you if you want them. There are a lot of different ways to be more free in the world, and using magic or making space for a spiritual practice in your life can be one of them. As always, I don't speak for anybody but myself. People can, will, and should disagree sometimes with the things that I or my guests say on this show. How will we ever learn anything if we were all in agreement on all things at all times after all anyway? Unlike those who attempt to be reasonable, should be willing to do, I can and often will revise my opinions or thoughts about things based on new evidence. Very excited to share the conversation that I had with Anthony Rella, author of the new book Slow Magic, and creator of the system or magical paradigm Slow Magic. We'll talk about internal family systems and Morningstar Mystery School, which are two touchstones of the slow magic paradigm. We'll also discuss looking at time in different ways, asking, is pagan time cyclical while Christian time is linear, perhaps? We'll get into magical thinking and much more. During a break, I'll provide a few definitions about magical thinking, which was also the topic of the panel discussion that we did for the last episode. Anthony Rella is a therapist as well as a magician and author, so it was cool getting his perspective about all of that. It's a really rad conversation that I'm stoked to share with you all. And I really like the slow magic system. It makes a lot of sense to me in terms of how I think about and do magic, and it's presented in what I think is a really chill and responsible way. I was really pleasantly surprised when I read it. It was kind of a breath of fresh air, to be honest. Before we get into it here, let me first remind you that if you like the show or the other work that I've been getting into, you can support it on Patreon. If you do so, you can take a bibliomancy break with me. There are no tiers or levels or whatever, so give as you will. Buy Me a Coffee is an option for those who wish to show their support with a one-time donation. Thank you so much to everybody who is already doing so. Your support makes this show possible by allowing me to cover the ever-rising expenses associated with making it, thereby justifying to myself the time that I spend. The support is especially helpful as demands for my time and energy increase due to some new life developments involving relocation. Very exciting times, but lots of work and learning new skill sets and the rest of it. So while I'm a little preoccupied by this complex task and possibly temporarily unable to make as many regular podcast episodes as I'd like, I will be adding a few cool bonus things to the Patreon to thank supporters. There's some fun short essays I've written about magic, which I'll share there, and there's some other stuff too. I really appreciate the opportunity to be making this thing, and having the resources necessary to reach you all today is a huge part of that, so thanks to the support which is making this show possible. Although I'm a pretty introverted person and I don't really use social media very much due to this, not there checking on stuff every day or anything like that. But that certainly doesn't mean that I don't want to hear from you all or anything like that. I'm beyond lucky to have such amazing listeners, collaborators, cohorts, co-conspirators, etc. I always welcome people's thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions, or arcane revelations for the listener mail segment. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com, or you can hit me up on Instagram for the time being at luxoccultpod, or find me on Blue Sky Social at luxastrata919. All right, fuck yeah, I'll be back during a break in the interview to share some definitions about magical thinking. But now, let me go ahead and set the table for you all by introducing my guest. Anthony Rella is a magic worker and psychotherapist working in private practice. He has been studying and practicing in the Western esoteric traditions of witchcraft and magic for more than 15 years and has been a mentor and teacher at the Morningstar Mystery School for the past 5 years. Anthony is also a founding member and vice president of the Seattle Temple of the Fellowship of the Phoenix. He authored Circling the Star and has contributed nonfiction and poetry to a variety of anthologies. And you can find his work at anthonyrella.com. All right, fuck yeah. Well, without further ado, let's get into it. Here's my chat about slow magic with Anthony Rella. All right, well, my guest today is Tony Rella. Tony, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Pretty good. Well, I'm so excited to talk with you about your book, Slow Magic, today, and some of the very cool concepts in it. I really resonated with a lot of what I found in this thing, and I'm excited to share it with the listeners.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Well, before we get into it, maybe we could just sort of like talk about the concept of slow magic. Like, what is this sort of maybe paradigm or system or however we would want to describe it?
Sure, yeah. Paradigm seems like a good word, and it's kind of I think of it as a way of just kind of holding the mindset of there's kind of two kind of connotations. One is to think about kind of long-term results and kind of thinking over months to years and kind of thinking about goals that you are kind of holding that they will probably come slowly, not necessarily things that you're going to expect to happen right away. The other side is to kind of slow yourself down in your process of doing magic or moving towards your goals or desires, because I talk about in the book and notice a lot sometimes when we want too much too quickly, or we do too much, or we expect too much of ourselves, we really kind of set ourselves up for failure, and we tend to overdo it. You can cause, in certain cases, like injury or burnout, and then so it's kind of the paradox is, we want things right away, of course. Like, I mean, I would love to have everything I want tomorrow, but sometimes if I overdo it, then the consequences of overdoing it actually make things take longer than if I just kind of slow myself down and I think, okay, what's my next step? Or like, do I have a foundation right now? Or is this a time when I can actually have that manifestation? Or do I need to take steps toward it in that long-term process?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, a sort of simple touchstone for this might be for people who are athletes. You can train really hard. You can overtrain and injure yourself, and then it will take longer to recover, and you might, have lost ground where you were trying to gain it or whatever. And
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
the idea of really slowing down and interrogating one's desires and the situation is something that we come to a lot in our discussions surrounding consent as well. And so I think that it's really nice to kind of introduce that into the whole kit and caboodle from the onset. So many
Yes.
people have sometimes like approached me with questions like, well, I did this thing and it didn't work. And it's like, well, how long did you do it? How big is this thing that you're asking for? Like, you don't really go out into your garden and plant a seed and water it and then wake up the next day and not see a plant and be like, oh, well, it didn't work,
Right.
right?
Right. Yes. And consent is another big subpart of the idea because, in the book and in life, we have so many relationships, and we have spirit relationships and relationships with other humans and plants and animals. And sometimes if you want something, we need help to get what we want. And part of the question is like, did you take time to check in with these spirits, these people who might have an opinion, who might, have a different timeline, who might have problems, and that's part of slowing down as well. It doesn't, you hold on to what you want, but you kind of check in with, the stakeholders or the beings that you want to support you and make sure they're on board. And that feels frustrating sometimes, but it actually increases your support. It decreases the friction.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that you brought up friction. I think that's a touchstone I come to with these things as well. And I love
Mm,
also that you mentioned the ability to renegotiate your interactions with your spirit allies or other, types of helpers.
hmm
These things are relationships. So yeah, there's a lot of great stuff in there. You mentioned that this sort of idea of slow magic, there's a couple of touchstones that you are sort of working with there. The Morning Star Mystery School was one of them, and
hmm
internal family systems was another that you mentioned. So I'm hoping that we can kind of give listeners some context about what these things are. And then with
Sure.
internal family systems, is something that I've found personally like really useful in my own life and something that I've played with in my magical practice too. I do have heard some controversy surrounding it as well, so we could just quickly address that too for folks.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so Morningstar Mystery School is a school that founded. It came out of the work of T. Thorne Coyle, who's a teacher and a witch who's still having a great career as a self-employed author right now, and still doing some teaching. But they came out of what's called the fairy tradition, or the Anderson fairy tradition, where they studied with fairy teachers and Victor Anderson, and also studied with a number of different other kind of spiritual paths, and also was a big involved in the reclaiming witchcraft community, which itself comes out of fairy tradition. And so years ago, Thorne was teaching a lot of students as sort of like a morning star sort of it was fairy, but it was kind of their own kind of flavor of fairy. And it was Morningstar Fairy at the time. And then after we were kind of training with them for a while and started to form this school, there became this point when Thorne was like, this work is so distinct from fairy that it makes sense to kind of formally separate it as its own thing. So it's still fed by that tradition, and a lot of cosmology and some of the practices and deities show up in Morningstar, but we also have our own kind of particular way of working with it and expressing it that isn't necessarily representative of the larger fairy community.
Yeah, right on. The morning star as a symbol is such an interesting one to me. I think about it
Mm,
often in its
yes,
context as being Venus, but then also having these Luciferian connotations. There's a lot to
yes,
unpack there.
yes, yeah, and Prometheus as well. It's a very rich symbol, and the more I learn about it, the more, when I first started, I was like, oh, that's a cool name, and then it's kind of this mystery that I learned a new layer about it, and I'm like, oh wow, there's a lot here, and just how interesting it is to have Venus and Lucifer kind of paired in that kind of occult way.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting ground to be gained, I think, in meditating on that stuff for sure. Very cool.
And then yeah, so internal family systems it's kind of my therapeutic home these days. I've been trained in it. I've done a couple of trainings and become certified in it, which just, I did a lot of hours, and somebody watched me do it and they said I did a good job. So so and I started doing that. I think in 2018 is when I first started getting trained in it after being a therapist for a long time. And it's a really unique approach to therapy that really resonates a lot with me and how I approach things and kind of my sense of being a magic worker. But also, I find it's very inclusive. It's a framework that can reach a lot of different people from a lot of different spiritual orientations or personal orientations, and also, people struggle with it. But the basic idea, it came out of the work of Richard Schwartz, who would say he discovered it in working with his clients just by being curious and kind of listening to how they talked about themselves.
Mhm.
But so it basically holds this idea of looking at human struggle as though we are composed of many parts of self. And so we would look at like a struggle. One of my examples is when I talk to clients, I'm like, let's say I've had a really long day at work and I get home and I'm just exhausted. And one part of me is like, hey, I need to put on my running shoes. I need to go running for an hour. That's going to make me feel really great. And then another part of me is like, hey, I'm going to sit on this couch. I'm going to eat a bunch of chips. I'm going to drink, and that's going to make me feel really relaxed, and that will be really great. And so we can say that these two kind of impulses, values, behaviors, we could think of them as like parts that both essentially want something good for us. They both want me to feel good in my body. They both want me to relieve stress. Both want me to be my best self. but they just have very different sort of approaches to that. And they kind of learn, these parts sort of learn these strategies over years, and they're like, wow, this really helped one time, so I'm just going to keep pushing this button. But the problem is, of course, then we have judgments, and these parts can go to extremes because, too much exercise, as we already talked about, can actually hurt your health. And of course, too much, relaxing, too much. I'm trying to think of a non-judgmental word, but all I can think of is indulgence, which is fine. It's fine to indulge sometimes, but too much of that can be hard for your health. And we get in this fight, like I think like one part of me is good, one part of me is bad. But IFS has this whole process of just really getting into this sense of like, wow, they both are really trying to help, and they could be working together. And if I can bring my presence, what an IFS is called, the self, the capital S self, this just sort of like really compassionate, non-judgmental awareness that's just like, hey, you guys, let's sit down and talk this out. And, maybe, we explore each part, and you can kind of talk to them as though they're their own being, and they start to give you, I think of it as animism for your feelings, basically. Like you treat your feelings like it's a little spirit, and you talk to it, and it tells you stuff. And in that process, it improves your relationship with those parts. It helps them to work together more effectively, and it can kind of surface. Sometimes they're doing their jobs because they're trying to manage unhealed pain, and we can go into that pain and we can heal it. Though that's, I think the great outcome is just that they all work together better. And so maybe I go for a half-hour jog and then I sit and relax for the rest of the night. Like that's a great outcome.
Yeah, thank you. Very cool.
Yeah.
The idea of finding these exiles, there's this idea of some of the parts of the self being like maybe shadows, I think was maybe another kind of touchstone here,
Mm-hmm.
like in a more Jungian context, like these parts that we've hidden away or that are we feel unsafe expressing, like the
Mm-hmm.
idea of like finding these things and making friends with them is something that I really pursued like very I think I pursued it very doggedly in the early stages of sort of discovering this stuff because I found it very, very useful.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there has been a few criticisms. I think that for my own interpretation of like when I've heard people like describing their issues with IFS, it seems to me like there is a sort of tendency that they're maybe taking what's said a little bit too literally. I've
Mm-hmm.
heard people bring up issues about this type of work potentially being dangerous to those who have problems with identity disorders or something like that. I'm curious,
Mm-hmm.
you're a mental health care provider and I'm not, so I'm so curious to hear like your sort of thoughts on this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean the whole idea of dissociative identity disorder, or what people used to call multiple personality disorder, it's always been kind of a controversial topic in the field. And I've heard criticisms kind of on two different kind of side from two different kind of approaches, two different camps. One is that a lot of people who identify as having dissociative identity disorder, or who work with those people, they criticize IFS. Their perspective is, these aren't parts; these are genuinely like personalities that I have to be in relationship with, and it's kind of that it's not appropriate to see them as parts that you can separate out and then reintegrate. So that's a criticism from that group. And then on the other side, there's the people who don't believe in dissociative identity disorder, or believe somehow as a therapist I can induce that. Which, to be honest, I mean, as a therapist, you have a certain amount of power and influence with your client that you have to be humble with. You have to be respectful of their autonomy. I think that's absolutely important. I also think sometimes we can get a little infantilizing of our clients and kind of over assume that they're these beings that we can just imprint diseases upon. Like I think people are way more resilient and robust than that. So there's a fear that in naming these things as parts, we're somehow fragmenting the person's identity and differentiating and separating out their being, causing them to be more dissociative. And I don't agree with that. Dissociation is one of the ways that people's psyches learn to manage and respond to traumatic experiences, where they learn to dissociate from the overwhelming pain. And so that's just a strategy that is kind of its own part that you have to befriend and see if it can help you to be more in your body. I think the idea that we have this like mono mind and we're one thing, and anything else is that's not the one thing is a sign of mental illness. Like I think that is wrong. Like I think that's what's causing a lot of our problems, because I
Mhm.
find for myself and with my clients, and yeah, clients too, in early stages get uncomfortable. They're like, I don't have multiple personalities. But I go back to the example I gave, like that's a normal conflict that you may not have that particular conflict, but there's been some time in your life where you did something and then thought you should have done the other thing, or felt ashamed of it, or wondered like, why did I did that? Why did I do that? Or, and so we all
Mhm.
have inner conflict. We all have complexity. We all have conflicting desires. And that's just normal. And it's actually freeing to step back and say, it's okay that I have inner conflict. It's okay that I have these conflicting desires. And how interesting would it be if all of these conflicting desires were kind of like my team, and I could just sit and listen to my team like say like why I want to do this, and then listen to the other one say why I want to do this. And then that actually lets there be a central consciousness, the capital S self, that's sitting and listening to the team. And it's like, yeah, those are good points, but we're going to do this. So I think, I don't know. I think it's a healing practice. It's not for everybody. If it's too weird for you, then don't do it. It is very weird, but I don't know. I just don't necessarily believe we can induce dissociative identity disorder in that way.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you. And of course, not everything is for everybody. And there's lots of modalities out there and lots of ways to do magic and all of that. So yeah, but thank you for
Totally.
getting into
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
I think there's also something that can be really natural about it, like the idea of calling the council that you mentioned in slow
hmm
magic. It really
hmm
reminds me of something that a friend of mine once described that he likes to do. He calls it his boardroom, where he's like this
hmm
kind of CEO of the company and he calls in all the different parts of himself for like a little meeting and let's see
hmm
what's going on. How about a quarterly report? And like so yeah, it
hmm
really sort of reminds me of that kind of thinking.
Yes. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, maybe we can switch gears here and kind of talking about like the idea of getting into the practice. I really like the way that you've kind of outlined the process of constructing a ceremony or a ritual or a spell or whatever non-maker people like to put on a magical operation of whatever type. And
hmm
the concept of befriending desire comes up around that same point. And I think there's a lot of folks that might have, and this comes up, I get a lot of questions about this where it's like, okay, I'm starting to like get into magic. I'm starting to like become comfortable with some of the tools and techniques and everything, but I'm having trouble to sort of figure out like where to apply this in my life. Like I feel
hmm
adrift that I have this new tool, but I don't know how to apply it. And I think that there's
hmm
a lot of useful things in slow magic about kind of sorting that out for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, that part of why I wrote the book is I've had the same problem over the years. I love magic. I find it really interesting. And then I do this thing and I'm like, okay, what do I do? What do I do with this?
So, in terms of befriending desire, could you talk a little bit about that as a concept?
Yeah, so befriending desire, to me comes from a lot of what we were just talking about from IFS in terms of just trying to approach all of my feelings, all my wants in a way that is about being friendly towards them, being curious, and really getting to know them. And many spiritual paths look at desire as a cause of suffering, which I think has validity to it, and also at the same time desire is there. Like desire walks with us. We have desires, even if we can't necessarily access those desires. Sometimes I don't feel like I have desire, but if I really listen to myself, there's usually something I want. Or if I'm feeling some kind of suffering in my life, I can look at that suffering as though it's sort of like a spotlight being cast by a desire. Like if I didn't want something, then I wouldn't be suffering because I would just be totally at peace with whatever happens to me. So if I turn towards that desire, or even just am curious, like what is this part of me wanting right now? What want is creating this experience of suffering or non-acceptance? Then you learn about yourself. You learn things that might be surprising, some things that might be scary, some things that might bring up shame or guilt. But also that's where a lot of the life force is. That's where the juice of life is sort of kept, is in these desires. And so when we approach those desires, it doesn't necessarily mean whatever comes to you is what you got to do, because sometimes desires are dangerous. Sometimes they're not okay to do to other people without their consent, or possibly ever, that there's no ethical way to do it. And at the same time, that's kind of what I think of as sort of the, I don't know, that's the desire's way of getting our attention. It's like if this part of me that wants something never really got a chance to sit down and think through to me what it really wants, then it's going to come out in this sort of unskillful way, this sort of maybe exaggerated way, and that might not be the actual thing. That might just be the pathway to what the real desire is, which might be something like, I want to feel powerful. I want to feel at ease in my body. I want to be loved. I want to have passionate love, all of these things. And so, befriending is really coming back into a relationship. It's not just about just letting it be your boss and doing whatever it says, but just being like, okay, well, that's interesting that this part of me is wanting that, and I want to go deeper into that. Like, what is it about this that feels really interesting or important? If I did get this desire that I want, what would that change in my life? What would that make possible for me? And I think those kinds of questions and reflections is what leads me to something that might be really actionable, and that might be something I can have in the journey towards the actual desire.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Yeah, and I like the idea of talking about it in terms of befriending. It's not like positional. It's not that one thing is in control of the other. They're cooperating.
hmm hmm Yeah, and then along with the boardroom analogy, this part of me might really want something, and then other parts of me might come up and say, you can't have that, or that's not feasible, or all sorts of things.
Mhm.
And they all get to have their say too. They don't have to shut down the conversation, but they're just adding pieces where I could just turn towards that. I could be like, yeah, that's a good point. Like that would be really dangerous, or that would, I don't really want to have that experience. But then that helps me to go back to deepening into the desire. Like, okay, if I couldn't do this particular thing, could I go deeper into the source of what this desire really wants?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Another really cool thing that I liked about the book was there's a lot of different lenses that are looked through, and the idea of looking at time these different ways, the idea of looking
hmm
at it as a line, as a cycle, and as a spiral.
hmm
I think that these things, I've actually used very similar language in kind of thinking about my own conceptualizations of time, the spiral
hmm
being the sort of like unification of these and some concepts of it. So yeah, I'm hoping we could talk a little bit about time and a little bit about the cyclical planetary magic that we find in slow magic.
Sure, that'd be great. A lot of that comes out of, in the Morning Star, there's this concept known as the divine twins. They embody all oppositions, all dualities. And it's a big part of my practice, something I'm really drawn to. And I find it useful, because duality is kind of both like false and useful. Like the two are parts of a whole, but when we separate them out, you get these really interesting insights that then they can reintegrate. And so looking at time as a line, looking at as a cycle, they both yield really interesting insights, but neither of them are complete on their own.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the idea of the twins. It comes up in a few different contexts. We see like Jupiter and Saturn kind of acting in these different, sometimes opposed ways. And I
hmm
wanted to mention and kind of touching back to Morningstar, the idea of goddess herself and kind of the
hmm
choice of this kind of gender description of deity.
That comes from Victor Anderson, who found with his wife Cora, they co-created the fairy tradition, and he used God herself as sort of the name of the star goddess as the way of referencing kind of the ultimate deity, but also I think it was a bit of a poke at the dominant Christian culture to take the term God himself and then to turn towards the goddess instead. And so this particular being, when I reference God herself, I use God herself in part because it's traditional, but also it just sort of emphasizes that this being is pre-gender, is beyond gender, includes all genders, and like God herself is everything. So you could say, God themself, you could say God himself or God herself or just God. And all of that would be true. And it all kind of surfaces a particular flavor of that being.
Yeah, I like it. All right. Thank you for explaining.
Yeah.
Foxtrot, 3, wrong.
Greetings, it is I, Luxa from the future. Thanks so much for listening. I hope that you're enjoying the episode so far. We still have plenty of awesome stuff to get into here, including a discussion about magical thinking, which is a great companion to the last episode of the show. That was a bonus in which I hosted a panel of practitioners to talk about their own practices and how they approach magic and mental health, specifically magical thinking. And we're going to hear Anthony Rella's thoughts about this after we come back from the break. But I thought it would be interesting and useful to look at the definition of magical thinking from a psychology model perspective, perhaps. These definitions are going to be coming out of psychology. So the APA Dictionary of Psychology defines magical thinking as the belief that events or the behavior of others can be influenced by one's thoughts, wishes, or rituals. Magical thinking is typical of children up to 4 or 5 years of age, after which reality thinking begins to predominate. Okay, thank you, APA Dictionary of Psychology. Magical thinking is one of those things that can be very context dependent and is something that we all engage in to one degree or another, I would argue. I think a touchstone for me here in arguing this is that a lot of advertising seems to rely on us doing a little bit of magical thinking in order for some types of ads to be effective. If we see, say, a car commercial where a well-dressed, conventionally good-looking person is driving through a beautiful landscape, having a great time with friends and loved ones, the car is maybe only a small part of that story being told. And how many cylinders does the engine have? Is it easy to replace the door handles if they break? What's the horsepower? How many miles of the gallons to get? It turns out most people tend to care much less about those technical details than about the vibes the car is giving, based in large part on the story being told about it in the commercial. This is a car for good-looking, well-dressed people who have fun with friends and loved ones in beautiful places. And by buying and having the same thing that these idealized, probably imaginary people we see on TV or whatever have, the car, the viewer feels that they will be sort of taking part in some measure of that identity. You also can have this wonderful life and indeed be the type of person who drives this car based on the ad, and all you need to do is just buy the car. But will having the specific car advertised actually change who you are or your friends or your life? Perhaps, but likely not to the degree that is suggested by the ad. And this difference between the desired outcome and the reality can lead to dissatisfactions and feelings of emptiness, which one maybe could fill by buying more things, not sure, but not to mention debt, right? Just one example, but we can see a lot of places in life where this type of magical thinking or other types happens if we want to deconstruct things. We're going to be hearing a few of Anthony Rella's thoughts about the topic soon and much more, but first let's take a quick look at a little bit of a more in-depth definition of magical thinking from Britannica. So they say that magical thinking is the belief that one's ideas, thoughts, actions, words, or use of symbols can influence the course of events in the material world. Magical thinking presumes a causal link between one's inner personal experience and the external physical world. Examples include belief that the movements of the sun, moon, and wind, or the occurrence of rain can be influenced by one's thoughts or by the manipulation of some type of symbolic representation of these physical phenomena. Magical thinking became an important topic with the rise of sociology and anthropology in the 19th century. It was argued that magical thinking is an integral feature of most religious beliefs, such that one's inner experience, often in participation with a higher power, could influence the course of events in the physical world. Prominent early theorists suggested that magical thinking characterizes traditional non-Western cultures, which contrast with more developmentally advanced, rational, scientific thought found in industrialized Western cultures. Magical thinking then was tied to religion and, quote, primitive cultures and considered developmentally inferior to the scientific reasoning found in more, quote, advanced Western cultures. This perspective influenced 20th century psychological theorists, notably Sigmund Freud and Jean Piaget. Freud argued that there are two fundamental forms of thought, primary and secondary process. Primary process thought is governed by the pleasure principle, where id-driven, instinctual desires seek fulfillment without consideration of the constraints of the external world. Magical thinking, the belief that wishes can impose their own order on the material world, is a form of primary process thought. Secondary process, in contrast, is a more advanced development, according to Freud, resulting in the emergence of the ego, which provides rational assessments under direction of the reality principle that allow for adaptive responses to the environment. Freud used this model of individual development to explain the stages of cultural development proposed by anthropologists. That is, Freud posited that the development of the individual from the id, impulses, and magical thought of childhood to the ego constraints and rationality of adulthood mirrored the development of human cultures from magical religious to rational scientific. Paget's investigation also placed magical thinking at the center of young children's thought. Paget queried children about their understanding of events in the physical world and discovered that children, before the age of 7 or 8, impute their own activity as the causal source for physical events. Research suggests that magical thinking is both less and more pervasive than previously thought. First, evidence suggests that although young children do utilize magical thinking, their egocentrism is much less pervasive and profound, and they are capable of a much more sophisticated understanding of physical causality at a much earlier age than Paget proposed. Second, adults, despite their capacity for scientific reasoning, do hold religious beliefs that often involve features of magical thinking, engage in magical thinking at times, and can be influenced to think thusly under some circumstances. This is Luxa, I was thinking advertising. Back to Britannica. Third, the magical thinking of children may be distinct from the religious beliefs of adults, which address metaphysical considerations about ultimate questions of life, meaning, being, and mortality that involve more sophisticated cognitive consideration than is found in children's magical thought. All right, a lot to unpack and very relevant to a magical practice and to understanding some of what's going on in the world. And politically, magical thinking plays a huge role in elections and things like that too. Thanks to Britannica for that. I think in Britannica's definition, we can definitely hear the places where racism and other types of prejudice have maybe added a lot of bias in the construction of these models. It's always important to go back and reevaluate things continuously. One of the things that I like so much about science as an activity. Gotta keep asking questions. Anyway, this idea that a Western rational scientific society is like the more derived, more evolved thing that naturally people just evolve into is really challenged and really called into question. I don't think that there's a whole lot of actual like scientific support for this little narrative. There's a great book, The Dawn of Everything, which kind of goes into this in case people are curious. All right, well, that is magical thinking in a small nutshell for y'all. Lots of other great stuff to get into here today, so let's dive back into the rest of my chat with Anthony Rella. I'm hoping that I could ask you a sort of similar question as I posed to members of my community about the idea of magical thinking in a magical practice and the ways that this can be both beneficial to us and also potentially harmful, and the ways that we navigate that within our own lives. And I think that your perspective as like a mental health care practitioner on this would be particularly valuable. So if you wouldn't mind giving a couple of opinions on that, I would love to hear them.
Sure. It's a complex topic, and it's interesting. I took in my graduate training, I took a class on psychology and spirituality. And we had a lot of great conversations. And one of the things we read was from integral psychology, which is its own kind of perspective. And they have this idea of, there are many developmental models, but they had a particular sort of developmental model for spiritual and sort of philosophical awareness of the world. And they talk about magical thinking as being a really early developmental stage that children go through. And it's kind of a normal thing that you experience when you're a little kid. You kind of look at the world. You don't exactly understand causality. You are sort of aware of your thoughts and feelings, and you start to get this sense that like my thing was always, if I looked at an airplane and I imagined it exploding, I was afraid I would cause the airplane to explode. And so I was so afraid to look at the airplanes and afraid, but of course, just in worrying about that, I was doing it. And so, my young little kid me would get so tangled up. And of course, the planes never exploded. It took a while to integrate that evidence. But So it is normal, and it's something that we integrate. And then I think when we come back to it as magical practitioners in an interesting way. I think with more of the maturity of our other perspectives that we've integrated through our life, ideally a bit more grounded, a bit more aware that other people are real and have as much agency in this world as we do, although not everyone gets that, but that the sense that we live in a material world that has its own rules and is not totally ruled by your thoughts and feelings, and that there are certain changes you can't just kind of think into being. But so what I think is useful about magical practice is we have a ritual container that lets us step into, we step out of the mundane world or step out of the day-to-day thinking briefly, cast a circle, light a candle, do banishings, whatever it takes to kind of make your space and your psyche feel this like I'm in this world that's not fully this world, and I can influence subtle forces in a way to get what I want. It's an interesting question that I don't know if I fully am resolved in my answer to. I'm always kind of interested to keep exploring like what is magic and what causes it to work. But there's a way in which ritualizing something and just for the sake of doing that ritual, believing that what you're doing is going to work. Early in my training, I encountered the thought that, your whole day-to-day life, you can think magic is ridiculous. You can doubt that it works. But if you step into the ritual space, you have to act as though it's real and though it's going to work. And if you can just do it for that ritual, then changes happen. And then you step out of the ritual and you can go back to being like, I don't know if that meant, accomplished anything. And that's totally fine, which is actually a pretty freeing perspective. So I think, we're kind of stepping into the power of magical thinking to really believe for this time, I can create something meaningful. I can create a change. And if I do these motions, I am enacting this change in my life. And I think whether on the subtle level, we're using our will to influence the subtle kind of currents or to connect to subtle currents, or if you think it's all psychological, you're just kind of telling your parts how you want your life to go. Either is fine interpretation, in my opinion, and it goes better. So I think, if magical thinking is ruling your life, your day to day, and you're not able to hold a job or feed yourself or maintain your relationships, then it's not really serving you. And I think that's part of, again, why we have these practices, these containers, these ritual structures. We're saying, I'm going to do this for this span of time, and then I'm going to go back to the regular world where I have to pay rent and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And just in my own kind of like observation as a non-professional person, like there's so many things about it that are sort of confusing. Like people who are, say, really, really religious and maybe Catholic and have really intense, fear surrounding not praying the rosary every day or whatever type of
Mm-hmm.
practice that might be, and the way that that's sort of thought of by society as being like, oh, well, they're just a really religious person. But if it was maybe something that wasn't in a religious context, that behavior might be sort of pathologized or might be
Sure.
contextualized as, being pathological, I
Right.
guess. So, and I think it's just so interesting how important the social context is. And I suppose that that's sort of like
Yes.
what it is. Like, can you integrate yourself back into the social context you find yourself in?
Yeah, absolutely. And some years ago, I was reading a bunch of research on psychotic experiences, religious psychosis, and just kind of doing a survey of what research I could find. And one of the interesting things was, they looked at different religious cultures that were strongly religious and the kind of delusions that people would have. And the general finding was that the delusion would be consistent with whatever religion or culture that person practiced. So if they were Catholic, they would have kind of Catholic delusions, and they were Hindu, they would have like more Hindu congruent delusions. But those delusions were also out of alignment with the general consensus of that religious practice. If you were a fellow Catholic or Hindu person and you saw or heard what they were doing, you would say like, "Hey, I don't think that's what we actually mean here. I think you're going too far." So
Mhm.
it's really fascinating to me in that way, that there is something, we're so informed by our culture, and then there's something that seems to be across cultures, but it still has to be expressed within that culture. So there's that. And then to me, that also comes back to the importance of community norms, and especially when we're practicing magic community or paganism with our pagan groups, that our cultural norms actually do matter. And I think a lot of magic people like being iconoclasts and like being rebellious and revolutionaries, and just want to think of ourselves as Jack Parsons or whoever, and that's cool. Like I respect that. And also that's that idea, that way that we hold sort of these communal norms, and we're able to kind of check each other and be like, hey, I think your magical thinking is maybe a little bit beyond what we're doing, what we kind of how we kind of see it. That can be helpful to people in their mental well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's some touchstones in slow magic in regards to the magical traps that you mentioned. These pitfalls that one might want to avoid. And I really like that you have a sort of strategic way of freeing yourself from these things laid out in there as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I really like that chapter. I mean, there's a lot of kind of mini essays in that, but it's sort of this kind of recognizing that on a magical path there are certain, I think 4 or 5 kind of ways of thinking that I tend to focus on. But just this idea that when we're growing, we're in a developmental process. When you enter into something, it feels great, it feels empowering. You might think of yourself as a chosen one. You might have a spirit or deity tell you that you're a chosen one, or that you're, a child of this deity. That's really elevating. It can feel great. It can feel like a source of power. And also, as we continue to practice and grow, it can start to be a trap. It can start to distort your thinking. It can start to distort your relationships with other people. It can lead to sort of like cultic behavior that's not really healthy for anybody, in my opinion. And so that's a part of continuing to grow, is to really inhabit what's working for you. And then when it starts to be constraining or distorting, to be willing to kind of step out of it, or being willing to interrogate, this might be a truth, but is it really? I think it goes back to what I was saying about desire. If a spirit tells me I am their child, parts of me that really want to feel special, that want to
Mhm.
belong, that want to feel powerful, really get in like, yeah, that's great, I am this thing. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be that serious. It could be like, yeah, thanks, mom. Like, I love you too. Like it's
Yeah.
like and I don't know if the spirits necessarily want us to destroy ourselves in their service. I mean, I don't think that's useful. And I think they're kind of looking to us to lead, to tell them what humans need and don't need. But I think we could go deeper, like maybe it just means I have a really deep relationship with the spirit, or, their energy really expresses through me, and I can honor them, I can reverence them, but that doesn't necessarily mean like I am this chosen one above all other people. There might be 100 people who are also a child of the spirit.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I'm curious. There's a sort of topic of interest of mine is the idea that, we can access these altered states of consciousness sometimes through these magical practices, whatever they might look like. And you mentioned spiritual psychosis. I'm guessing this is, one version of this. Another version that I'm really curious about is this notion of spiritual ecstasy. And I'm curious if you came
Mm.
across anything like that in your research.
Oh gosh, that would be an interesting. Yeah, I haven't really looked into that as much, but that would be a really interesting thing to study. And I'm sure there are people doing that work. Oh, I'm trying to remember. There was a study about, they compared they did brain scans of nuns praying the rosary and kind of Buddhist monks in a meditative state. And they found some really similar, when they really got into those ecstatic states, there were really similar things happening to their brains.
Hmm.
And it'd be interesting to go back to that. But I remember it's kind of like one of the things that sort of turns off is that sense of time and separation. The theory was, when they were looking at the kind of what was being lit up in their brains, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the specific structures, but that the parts of our brain that tell me like I'm a separate being and my body is oriented in this space, that part kind of goes away, and they felt like that sort of indicated that state of oneness of feeling kind of beyond the self.
Hmm. Very interesting. Very cool.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated a lot of what you wrote about in terms of not just working with spirits in chill and functional ways, but also working with other people. And there's a lot of
Mm,
really good thoughts about group organization and sort of orienting oneself within structures, interrogating the pitfalls and also strengths of given ways of doing things in terms of like how defined will the group be and things like that. And I'm hoping you could comment a little bit. I'm going to quote a little bit from this because it hit me so hard when I read it that I was like, I need to underline this and like maybe write it on a sticky note and put it in front of me when I work. The accelerated path to leadership, burnout looks like second guessing every decision with anxiety about alienating a nebulous group of people. And this is
mhm,
something that I was lucky enough to take some classes about consent and leadership with an organization called Consent Academy this last summer. And this was
mm,
sort of one of the first things that was talked about, the sort of idea of like you're always going to be criticized when you're in a position of leadership. That's just always
yes.
sort of going to be the case. And like it
Yeah.
becomes really important then to like, figure out like, well, where is my ethical alignment? Where is the compass, as you sort of put it? Where is my own personal compass, my own personal,
Hmm.
mission statement about how I want to operate or whatever, form it might take. And
Hmm.
really sort of using that to orient yourself and saying like, okay, well, people are saying these things about that. And am I still walking in alignment with my own compass or have I strayed
Hmm.
off the path? And it's really being able to orient yourself that way. And people are allowed to say and feel however they want to about what you're doing. And as long
Uh,
as you're doing things within your own ethical alignment, that's really all you can do. But that's a really hard lesson, I think, to kind of take home. It took a very long
yes.
time for me. So yeah.
That's right. Yeah, for long time, I had this mantra where I'd tell myself, people are allowed to be mad. And like, I just had to
Hmm.
keep going back. People are allowed to be mad. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to stop them from being mad. Yeah, I've been in and out of leadership of pagan and magical communities almost the whole time I've been pagan. I got in very quickly and just kind of learned these things the hard way. And what feels important is that recognition. And I use this image that you were naming about the compass, where I kind of break down these components of a group in terms of like a basic compass, where there's a circle, there's a center, and then there's the needle pointing. And a compass would be pointing north, but I have it pointing towards kind of the mission of the group, like what the group's purpose is.
Hmm.
And that kind of keeps us oriented, coming back to, okay, what are we actually here to do? We're not just here to argue with each other. We're here to put on ritual, or we're here to do service. And let's make sure that we're staying on our purpose. I'm getting a little off your question, but I do notice how often in groups people come together because they want to do things like magic or activism or service, but they really have a hard time actually doing it. And like somebody needs to come in and say, all right, we're going to start the class now, because people just have a hard time kind of voluntarily jumping into that stuff. What I like about the circle and the center as an image, it really helped me to understand these group dynamics because, in a circle, the circle is all the membership of your group. Everyone who's inside the circle is whoever is a part of your organization, and then everyone outside of the circle are, might still be important. They might be, involved or just people you have to deal with, but they're not your membership. And so I think it's important to have a clear line around who is a member, who are we serving, whose opinions matter the most in this group. And then the center is kind of whoever is in charge of the group, or whatever your central mysteries are, or your central practices. And being in the center is a very different experience than being in the circle on the edges. And I've seen it myself. I've seen other people do it. People in the circle like love to complain and will always have a different opinion. And it's not that their complaints are bad or wrong. Like sometimes they're very sharp and insightful because they can see things from their perspective that it's hard to see from the center. But
Hmm.
at the same time, when you're in the center, you are, in a circle, the center is connected to all points of the circle equally. And so when you're in charge, you are responsible for the entire circle, and you have that power. Like whatever you do changes and affects the whole circle. So that's why people have so many opinions, and it doesn't feel like you have all this power because you're just the same person, but people suddenly treat you like you have all this power, and you have to kind of accept that and sort of soften a little bit, because if when you're on the edge, you might feel like you have to be really loud and strident to get attention to your needs. But when you're in the center, if you bring that same loudness and strident, then people are going to think you're a tyrant. They're going to not want to listen to you, or you might just have all these emotional impacts that you're like, where did that come from?
Mhm.
Not recognizing the power of your words. And so, I think it's important to listen to the edges and to be open to it, but also the people on the edges don't necessarily know what you're hearing. Someone on the eastern quadrant might have this specific critique that's completely opposite to the people in the western quadrant, and they might not even know that they have completely opposite critiques. But if you're in the center, you're hearing both of them, and you got to figure out what to do with that. And then the last piece I want to say too, just related to what you're saying about leadership and in being in integrity, is one of my sort of drums that I beat a lot, or things that I kind of have come to peace with, is people get to complain. That's totally fine. And sometimes the criticisms are useful, but if I have a meeting and they don't come, then I don't know what to do with their complaints. We have these structures. We have to create structures to make choices together. Otherwise, it's chaos. If somebody's just like, I'm changing the group, I was sitting at home, Isis spoke to me, and now we're all going to bring roses to circle next week. And that's how you're kind of running your group. And then somebody else is like, well, I mean, Osiris told me that we have to all burn coal. That creates chaos. But
Sure.
if we all come together and we say, okay, here's the proposal on the table, let's have this discussion, and now we're going to vote. That's the group has decided this is how we make decisions for the group. We come to the meeting, we talk about it, we have a vote. That brings predictability, that brings structure, that creates an opportunity for the people to do something about their complaints. And if they don't want to participate in that process, then I'm not sure how much they value their complaints. And that's a harsh thing to say. I think there's also room to kind of be curious, like, what is it about that process that maybe feels unwelcoming to them? And I'm be open to having those conversations, but sometimes people aren't willing or able to have those conversations. And it goes back to that burnout quote you were saying. Like, if I don't want to burn out, then I have to hold some limits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also a lot to be said for embracing healthy conflict. There's going to be disagreements, and sometimes that's necessary, and
Hmm.
understanding that conflict isn't bad. It can be very productive and good in the right context. This is how we can
Yes.
solve problems. But
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think so many of us are trained to be so conflict avoidant that that can also be another hurdle for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, another thing I noticed too was just the stress of some situations and the sort of like idea that stress and trauma are so kind of connected, and like, if we become too stressed out, too overextended, we can kind of end up in these, as you've mentioned, like these stressful things coming out, maybe, trauma responses or other things like that coming up that make it more difficult to sort of like see one's way and like look at that compass. And I think the idea again of just slowing down and really taking the time to evaluate very little of what we will be doing in like a magical group is going to be an emergency that requires immediate
Right.
action, but sometimes
Right.
things can feel that way in the moment. And I think,
Okay.
yeah, the idea of just really having that idea of like, no, it's totally okay to put on the brakes, to have difficult conversations when it's easy to
Hmm.
have them, and things like that are, yeah, so important.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, this is something I often think, and it's hard to practice because we're so busy. Most of us are so busy, but sometimes it's useful to separate out the conflict from the problem solving kind of processes. Like, can we just have an hour where we're just going to lay on the table everything we're upset about. That sounds like a nightmare. Maybe more structure to that, but we're going to focus on this particular topic, and everyone. It's like the boardroom again. Like everyone gets to express what they're struggling with, and I talk about in the book too. I have sort of like a way of just hosting that conversation where we just get clarity on what the collective problem is from hearing from everyone's individual frustrations, struggles. And so we're just going to have a process for that. Then we're going to take a break. We're going to sleep. We're going to eat. We're going to, relax. And then we'll come back and then we can start talking about solutions. Because I think when people want to solve problems quickly, and of course it's exhausting, but if we're having different conversations, then it muddles things up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this comes up sometimes in relationships for me. I am such a problem-solving type of a person. I want to offer solutions, and this isn't
Yeah.
always what is needed or supportive of those around
Yeah.
me. And so really asking and checking in, like, are you like hoping to have like, just talking about this? Are you asking for solutions? Just, yeah, I love separating those things out is important. So yeah.
Yeah, because sometimes when people just feel heard, then that's enough. They just needed to express the frustration and they felt heard, and they sometimes they don't need a solution beyond that.
Yeah.
So that's freeing.
Yeah. Maybe we could talk about the silver and black mirror exercise that is in slow magic.
Sure. So that comes from how Thorn Morningstar, we have the silver and the black mirror as both magical tools associated with kind of the expansive sort of heavenly stellar realms. And they both reflect, different facets of truth and being. And I really like that. You look at the silver mirror, both of them can kind of have illusions or like show you things that are surprising, but the silver mirror tends to reflect more of a this world sort of clarity, sometimes more than we want,
Mm.
and kind of show us like how we see ourselves, who we think of ourselves. And then the black mirror, of course, is more tends to be more for psychic scrying, for talking to beings beyond this realm, or sometimes in Morningstar we'll work on it, talking to kind of shadowy parts of self, kind of seeing what gets reflected back. And so I use this as a group exercise where, and this is drawing on some of my experiences as a therapist, where it's two kinds of witnessing, where the person gets to say kind of whatever they want to say, whatever's in their heart or whatever their intention is. And the silver mirror is reflecting back just word for word what the person said, shows them how their body was, how their tone was, like doesn't add commentary or editing, isn't like that was so inspiring or like I don't think that means anything, but just to really show back to that person the energy they just put out,
Mm.
which can be so healing, liberating, integrating. Just something in us really wants to be witnessed and just to be seen for who we are. And when we see things reflected back, sometimes that just helps us to integrate it more. And sometimes we get that perspective of like, oh, actually, I don't like that. It sounded great in my head, but now that I'm hearing it back, that doesn't sound so great. So that's what the silver mirror offers. And then the black mirror, I like kind of is listening with more of that psychic sort of witchy sense where they're sensing in the energy, they're sensing, what's coming up in their body. Maybe there's symbols or images in their kind of psychic vision, and they're just sharing that information. As I heard you, I saw a star kind of emerging from a black hole. I saw fairies dancing, and so then that is just, they don't have to know what that means, but just to share. And also I felt like a lot of heaviness as I was hearing you talk, and so that's information for the person too. And what I like about it is, I'm really into community, and as we just talked about, I'm also very frustrated by community. It's the best and worst thing about being a human being is how much we need each other.
Oh, it's so true.
And so much of magic is solitary, and that's not bad, but I think we really run into our own blind spots and don't have anyone to help us see that they're blind spots. and even to feel witnessed or held. And so just having these two ways of being seen can give us a lot of information, a lot of power.
Yeah, fuck yeah, I love that. There's some
Yeah.
very strong moon card from the tarot vibes in what you said about the two mirrors. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, the
Yeah, I like
last
that.
thing that I was hoping to ask you about before I ask you if there's anything that I didn't ask you about, is the idea of the law of maximum inconvenience. I absolutely love this. People talk about how hilarious the universe is with its sense of humor in
Uh,
granting us our desires, and I think this is a great touchstone. So, could you talk a little bit about this law?
Sure, yeah. So the law of maximum inconvenience is to me a very true law. And the basic premise is that whatever it is that you most need to happen is going to happen in a way that is the most inconvenient for you and the worst possible time. And I think this is a true law. It's like, and I go into it in so many ways, but it's sort of, the example that's coming to mind is, I used to work as a barista and I was in graduate school, so I'd have a backpack full of really heavy books because I'd be trying to read them on my lunch break or read them on the bus. And I'd have a long day on my feet and I would walk to the bus stop with this heavy backpack on and I'd be standing there waiting for the bus, and the bus would never come. It would never come. And I'd be like so tired. So finally, I'm like, I'm just gonna take this backpack off and rest. And as soon as I put the backpack on the ground, then the bus shows up, and that's the law of maximum inconvenience. It's like you can wait and wait because in my head I'm like, oh, the bus will be here, then I'll get to sit, and I won't waste the energy of taking my backpack off. But now the universe has just wasted all this energy. It's this sort of like as soon as I give in, then the thing I really want happens. But now it happens in a way that's inconvenient for me, and it's kind of frustrating. And I don't know. It's pretty tongue in cheek, but I just think it's a fun thing to think about. And ultimately, I think it unpacks. One of the examples I use in the book is, if you ask someone on a date and they don't respond, they don't text back, and you're like waiting and you're not making plans for the weekend, and then finally you make plans for the weekend and then they text back, it's
Like
just sort of
clockwork, yeah.
like clockwork. Yeah, yeah. And I think there's something, honestly, I do think there's something magical and energetic about it. I feel like there's something about my attachment. I don't know, like I feel like there's something blocking receiving the results. And it's that sense of urgency or like needing them to respond or needing the bus to show up and kind of like suffering. Another great example is, when I've had my stoic times where I've endured hardship and I think I'm being so righteous by not complaining about it. Then finally one day I break down and I just complain. I'm like, this sucks, this is awful. And then all of a sudden it changes. And then I'm like, oh, I should have never complained. But I think it was actually the surrender that made it possible for the result to come through because just, yeah, like it
Yeah.
feels like opening up energy, letting go of this thing I'm putting out and just letting something respond. But it does feel embarrassing.
Well, yeah, I think that the touchstone of surrendering, or like, there's a concept in my circles that's like, it's not good to lust for the results of your magic. Like, it's good
Yes.
to do the thing and then kind of operate from the standpoint that what you've set in motion is already happening. It's already a condition in the world, so you don't need to like want it anymore. And if you're
Yeah.
obsessing over it, it might make it harder for it to find its way to you, perhaps.
Right.
But
That's right.
there's, of course, there could be some confirmation bias in there. There's all kinds of ways of looking at this, but I think there's also a touchstone too of like, and this is something that you talk about in Slow Magic, looking at magic and at the world in this really holistic way and acknowledging that it is one connected system. So the things that
Hmm.
we do within our magical practice affect change in our own lives, and that can kind of like iterate on different like orders of magnitude and can cause sometimes like some intentional destabilizing effects in our world and everything. And
Yeah.
it's good to sort of understand that even if it's just a little change, everything is connected. And so it's good to be
Yeah.
prepared.
You're right. Right. Yeah.
Well, right on. I really appreciate that you taking the time to chat with me today. This has been awesome. Is there anything that you would like to talk about that I haven't mentioned? Or do you have any questions you would like to ask me?
Well, a part of me is sitting with you had asked me earlier about the time as line and cycle, and I'm not sure I went as deep into that topic as I could have. So feel like it's worth just outlining a
Let's
bit more.
cycle back to it. I love
Cycle back to
it.
it. I'm a very non-linear processor. So I kind of think about, the time as line and spiral. And there's some interesting sort of philosophical historical precedences that I don't know if I'm going to talk about more, but just actually maybe I will. There's this idea that pagan time is cyclical, and for some reason the idea that Christian time is linear. And I think the concept is that, pagans tend to be really connected to the cycles of the earth, the cycles of the sun, the moon, the seasonal cycles, the cycles of birth and death, and that there's a sense of just this eternal recurrence. In a pagan mentality, our work is just to like be in alignment with the seasons and just to kind of cycle through that, but you're not really expecting anything. You're just kind of in this eternal recurrence, and then the I don't know if I agree with this. It's just a belief that's out there that Christianity kind of introduced this line, which is like you're born and you're on this trajectory to death, and you're going to go to a different place when you die than when you were born.
Mhm.
And so there's
And
this
the whole
idea that
world might end. Yeah, like,
and the
right?
whole world, man. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That the world is on this linear trajectory too. And so linear time has really become the dominant sort of way we think about time in our Western culture and American culture. And we kind of have these stories about progress or decline, which is sort of the story of progress is that we are on this upward climb to making the world really great, and we're solving all these problems with technology or evolution or a higher perspective, and we're elevating ourselves, and yeah, we still have problems, but we're going to figure those out, and things are just getting better and better. And then there's this idea that in the past things were terrible and they were like, not enlightened, whatever. Then what I decline is kind of the shadow of that, which is that in the past things were really great. People were moral, people were aligned with the earth, or they were, aligned with their deity. And ever since then, things have gotten worse and worse. We've gotten further and further away, and modern society is just an abhorrent departure. So I think both of those are. I don't align with either of them anymore. I used to believe in progress, and now I see that everything is a give and a take. You make a gain and you lose something. And for every gain we make, we also lose something else. And for every loss we have, we gain something.
Mhm.
And I think there's just change. But at the same time, there's something useful about the linear model because we think of our lives as a linear process. My individual life, I do have a narrative story. I can think about my childhood. I can see how things from my childhood are affecting me today. And I have a hope for a future that could be different or a future that I'm moving towards. And that time as line chapter, I felt was really important to me because during the COVID isolation period, I really felt like I lost that idea of having a future for a while.
Mm.
Like it just kind of felt like we were stuck in an eternal present. And I realized how important it is psychologically to believe there's a future and that the future I believe I'm going to have also really informs how I act in this moment. If I think my future is going to be miserable, then I'm going to act in ways that might increase that misery in the moment. Whereas I believe that there could be a better future, then that might create space. And that goes back to desire, to align with the future I desire rather than the future I'm afraid of. And then often the futures that I'm afraid of are coming out of experiences I had in my past. And so in that chapter, I have this sort of way of working with going into the past to kind of detangle those stories that are tripping you up to create the possibility of a future that might help, that you can live into and have a better present. So that's linear time. And then the cyclical time is just really, looking at, to me, that moves out of the personal narrative story and into a relationship with the larger world, the larger cosmos, and just this sense of, I use this kind of story about, or theme about currents, like currents of water or air that are moving, that if you can align your magic with those currents, and those currents are going somewhere you want to go, then you're supported, then you're flowing with that current and you don't have to work so hard. But I see the looking at the world as cycles as a way of kind of gauging where the currents are. And so if I'm in a particular season, then, certain kinds of magic, I'm not going to plant flowers in the winter, but I might plant flowers in the spring. And so using that sort of way of thinking to also look at astrologically the movement of the planets as their own kind of cycles, that they're moving kind of in these eternal recurrences, kind of interacting with each other and kind of telling a story together. And you can look at, if I like right now I'm working with Jupiter energy, so I'm doing this magic to sort of like look at where Jupiter is and try to kind of think about where I want to be when Jupiter's somewhere else in my chart, and to kind of do magic to kind of telling Jupiter, like, this is where I want your current to take me once we're over here. But so that's the other piece. And then, of course, as you were saying earlier, everything's really a spiral. The planets aren't, when we look at the way the planets are actually moving through space, it is a spiral. Like the sun is having its own kind of cycle around the galactic center, and the planets are kind of following it, kind of like they're cycling around, but they're actually kind of moving in three-dimensional space in this sort of spiral pattern. Mm-hmm. So the truth is this both and of, we keep going over the same territory, like, much of human experience isn't really that different, birth, death, illness, health, the seasons, although those are changing because of our actions. But then every time we move around a cycle, we're at a different position. We're a different place in the spiral. So we can look at the history of where we were in these previous moments in a kind of linear way. So that just kind of gives us a couple different lenses to assess where we are and where we're going.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm a huge nerd for astronomy and stuff. And you're right, there's this kind of huge corkscrew that our solar system and even sort of the galaxy, everything is just sort of rocketing in these big spirals. It's very interesting. So yeah.
It's really cool. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, is there anything that you're excited about besides slow magic that you would like to put in a word for?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna be at Paganicon. I never know if I'm pronouncing it right.
Paganicon. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, next month or in March, and I'm looking forward to that. That will be cool. And I'm just kind of I'm excited to see kind of where these conversations go. I think that's kind of what I got going on. I'm unfortunately, so we teach what we need to learn, and I wrote a book to kind of. Now I need to take my own advice in terms of planning ahead. I feel like so much of my work was getting me to this point, and now the book's out, and I'm like, oh, what do I do next? So I need to be projecting forward myself. But
right on. Well, yeah. So people can find you at Paganicon soon. Where can they find Slow Magic?
You can find it anywhere you get books. It's through Llewellyn, so you can get on Amazon. I like bookshop.org. You can buy it from Llewellyn's site, and a lot of bookstores are carrying it, or you can also request, if you have a favorite local bookstore, you can ask them to carry it. So there's a lot of ways to get it.
Very cool. And is there a place where people can check out any other work that you might have out there?
Sure. Yeah, you can go to my website, which is anthonyrella.com, ANTHONYRELLA.com. And that's, it's my therapy website, but I also have a place for writing and books and some links. I have a couple books with Gods and Radicals, or I think they're Rotona now, a smaller press. And also I have a blog. I'm kind of playing with having a Substack. So if you go to the site, I'll put a link up to that. And I'm still kind of figuring out, I'm trying to decrease my reliance on Facebook.
Yes, understandable.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been super fun. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much to Anthony Rella for joining me. Definitely check out the book Slow Magic if today's discussion was interesting to you. There was so much that I really appreciated about the book, as I said earlier. Check the show description and show notes for links to Anthony's work. All right, before I let you go with a few final thoughts, let me say thank you so much to the people who are making the show possible by giving on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, and to the people who are supporting the show by spreading the word. To all of your friends, allies, and magical associates about it, as well as everybody you meet at the next PTA meeting, choir rehearsal, bake sale, anarchist collective, coffee clutch, seance, ceremonial potluck, or other event you attend. You can also post about it on social media or write a positive review where that's possible. Both of these things are super helpful, so thank you so much to everybody who is doing so. And yes, don't forget to smash the fucking shit out of that follow button so that you can get updates when new episodes come out. Quick word about the Green Mushroom Project, which is an ongoing group magical working based on the metaphor of the relationship some fungi share with some plants. In a nutshell, if we, the magical practitioners of Green Mushroom Project, are like a forest of trees, the green mushroom current connects us and strengthens us in unseen ways, like the mycelial network of a forest might do. In addition to this mycelial web, there are the mushroom spores, which are like little packets of the current's energy. These can be applied to situations by practitioners as needed. This represents the more celestial part of the project. Our newest experiment, Void House, is about investigating the healing and alchemical properties of consent, providing consent education to magically inclined people, and organizing consent-centered magical spaces for group work both in person and online. A lot of fun and free activities going on the Green Machine Discord server, home of the Green Mushroom Hypho Sigil Project and Void House. Join us for our weekly Fungal Friday chats, as well as special events like ceremonies and seasonal celebrations. There are also several educational opportunities available. Check out the Lux Occult YouTube to watch a presentation that Dave, Neal, and I recently did about trauma-informed practices and about ways that understanding this stuff can allow for more chill and consensual interactions in daily life and can allow for understanding oneself better, too. As always, much love and much love to everybody participating in the Green Mushroom Hypho Sigil Project, regardless of what that looks like for you in your practice. It's been such an honor and such a fucking privilege to be sharing this journey with you all. Fuck yeah. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com or find me on Blue Sky at luxstrata919 to get a link to that Discord server. All right, let's do a few listener mail and shout-outs. Shout out and fuck yar to all of the Pocket Wizards. Ever a pleasure seeing what y'all have going on and being inspired by your creativity and your courage and so many other fucking awesome things. So keep kicking ass out there. Shout out and thank you to Marcus Ironwood of Llewellyn for letting me know about Anthony's work and slow magic and for helping to coordinate the conversation today. Appreciate it. Greetings to Justin, and also to Sir Justin. Hope all of the Justins listening are doing well. Shout out also to Brother Stone, and thanks so much for reaching out. Appreciate it. Shout out to Keats Ross for giving me the book of poetry that I shared a piece from earlier. I fucking love it. Unmonstrous by John Allen Taylor is dope. You were totally right that I would like it. I appreciate it. Greetings to Veruca. Hope that you're doing well out there. Shout out to Tom Banger for letting me know about some very cool work taking place. And shout out to all of my fellow travelers on the path of magical resistance. Fuck yar. Thanks so much to everybody who has reached out and who's been supporting the show by rating, reviewing, and giving on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. Whether or not it was featured, know that all of the misses I receive are appreciated and cherished. A few quick programming notes here. Very stoked to be working on a few new episodes to share with you all. I spoke with Pear, who performs as the Tom O'Bedlam and is a fellow chaos magician and green mushroomist, about the ways that performance can allow you to explore different aspects of the self, or what's left over of you when you empty yourself of yourself, as Pear so nicely put it in our conversation. The Tom O'Bedlam will also be performing at Pagonicon this year, which I'm very disappointed to have to miss. I just have too much going on. But if you're going, make sure to say what's up to both Anthony, Rella, and the Tom O'Bedlam. I'm also working on a bonus episode with author and researcher Spencer Sunshine about Satanism and his new book, Neo-Nazi Terrorism and Countercultural Fascism. This came about as a result of a discussion that we were having on the Discord about people wanting to get into Satanism, but being really turned off by some of the weird racist stuff and people out there in Satanist circles and other areas of occultism. The Norse stuff has a huge problem with this, as most of you are likely aware. Lonnie Scott of Weird Web Radio has done a lot to speak out about this topic too, so shout out to you, Lonnie, fuck yeah. Spencer Sunshine goes into the historical research he's conducted and what the situation is like now, as well as what we can do about it. It's a really interesting conversation, even though it's about a very troubling topic. If you're a fan of David Lynch's work, check out my recent guest appearance on Planis podcast alongside Alan Greenfield, who you can hear in episode 45, Secrets of the Real Black Lodge Revealed with Alan Greenfield and Remembering Rendlesham. That's a fun dive down the rabbit hole if you're into UFO stuff or the interesting political puzzles which surround it. It's a real onion that I love to try to unpeel. Alan and I joined Flood for Planis podcast to talk about David Lynch's work and how it's impacted us as people and magicians, and about some of our favorite moments from the Lynch lore. I'll put a link to that in the show description. Lots of other great stuff coming your way, including the 100th episode, which will feature a very fun conversation I had with my brother about J.R.R. Tolkien's work and mythology of the world he created. My brother was the guest for the first episode of the show, so having him back for the 100th seems perfect. And holy shit, a lot has changed since I started making this thing. It's been a wild ride, and I'm so grateful for all that I've learned so far and for all the very cool people that I've had the chance to talk with and work with. It's been such an honor and a privilege. Gratitude. Some final thoughts here before I let you all go. The recent changes in my life have given me a lot of opportunities to stay flexible and adapt to evolving circumstances. It wouldn't be possible for me to make this podcast by myself and do the other organizing work I've been getting into and all the other stuff I do if I weren't the sort of type A control enthusiast who would be able to keep track of all of what goes into it. And honestly, I can't keep track of all of it anyway. Things definitely slip through the cracks and I forget stuff all the time. Like Anthony Rella mentioned, it can be good to take the advice of slowing down and digging in for the long haul and not overextending oneself. It's a balancing act I'm continually working on, and I feel so much passion and enthusiasm for the work that I'm doing, but I'm also a human in a meat suit that has its own silly demands for things like food and sleep and other non-exciting stuff like that. And although we can view time through a variety of different lenses, we also have a finite amount of it. There's so much pressure in our society to work continuously, to keep producing at any cost. It's sort of what is at the heart of our very unsustainable economic system. To hear more about that, check out the ad hoc history episode, The History of Money. You can learn why I say that. There's a lot of pressure to keep working without a lot of encouragement to look at things from a holistic, big picture perspective. Looking at things more holistically can be especially difficult when everyday concerns about basic survival needs like food and housing take center stage. It's pretty hard to think about your 5-year plan when you're not sure if you're going to be able to pay the rent this month. You're going to be thinking more in the short term about just making ends meet. And I don't think any of this is by accident. We don't need to talk about the gross robber barons at the helm of this cruise ship to hell, fuck them, but I do want to remind you to guard your minds against the continuing psyop which is taking place in the US, and to keep being as loud and fucking obnoxious as possible about your views to whoever your representatives in government might be. We are their boss, and they need to be reminded about that sometimes. Whatever it might look like for you in your life, I want to remind you to resist, and share the Green Mushroom Project statement of resistance. Resist. Resist by maintaining sovereignty of the self. Resist by maintaining love of the self. Resist by maintaining fierce loyalty to love and pleasure. Resist with acts of radical kindness. Focus on the path to better times. Fuck yeah. Thanks so much to Anthony Rella for joining me. Check out the show notes for links to his work and the book Slow Magic. Thanks so much for all the kind words and support for the show and my other work. Gratitude. Thank you to Hecate, The Void, and Team Unseen. And most of all, thanks so much to you for listening. Much love. This is Lux Strata reminding you to stay strong and stay fucking curious. And guard your mind. All right, I'm going to leave you all with a sort of more safe for work radio edit of the track Submerse from my second album, Kaleidokos. And a big part of making these sound magic experimental albums was conducting this, parts work, as we might call it, talking to these different parts of the self and having them have conversations or whatever. And I think in this track you can hear them playing together in a way that I really enjoy. So cheers. feel a laughing song in my scripture, alight with the madness of divine glee. The pages would sing to the music of the spheres, the beat of the pulse. So let us dance the steps of the moon, as initiates of the sect of knots has done since the stars first rose. And at the center of the storm with your hands, I would find the stillness of the evening stretching to night, and see these possible colors of a world that twines of ours like holy serpents twisting together through the corridors of time. Tasting the blushing flames of your fingertips, I would be drunk on the manna of your gaze, and sit at your knee as you whisper the story you tell again and again. In the end, the beginning. In the beginning, the end.
7 years. 7, 87, 7, 97, 8, 11, 11, 8, 21, 8, 23, 27, 8, 29, 8, 39, 53.
Well, don't ask the questions if you don't want to know the answers.
59.
Lux Occult is a part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.